On September 27, 2025, the world awoke to breaking headlines that would dominate every news cycle for days. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in a rare and confrontational move, issued a strict 72-hour ultimatum directed at Burkina Faso and, by extension, much of Africa. The demand was blunt: accept a controversial resource-sharing deal or face crippling political and economic retaliation. To some, it was a standard act of geopolitical muscle. To others, it was a stunning overreach, a calculated attempt to remind Africa that even in the 21st century, sovereignty often bends under the weight of global powers. But what came next shook the balance of that assumption. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before the cameras, unflinching, and declared, "Africa will not kneel. We reject this ultimatum outright." The clash between these two leaders, one representing a state long entrenched in Western alliances, the other symbolizing Africa's rising defiance, was more than a diplomatic spat. It became the center of a global showdown. Could Africa's new wave of independence resist such pressure? Or would Netanyahu's ultimatum trigger fractures, exposing the limits of Traoré's bold defiance? To understand why this single confrontation matters, one has to pull back and see the historical canvas on which it is painted. For decades, Africa's position in the global order was tightly bound by foreign dictates. Israel, though geographically distant, has long maintained strong military and technological ties with African nations. From arms sales to intelligence sharing, Tel Aviv positioned itself as both a partner and a gatekeeper. Western nations often leaned on Israel's alliances in Africa to safeguard their own interests. But as African leaders like Traoré began reshaping the political landscape, championing sovereignty, and expelling foreign military bases, these old partnerships started to crumble. Netanyahu's 72-hour ultimatum was not just about a deal. It was about restoring control, reminding a restless continent of who still held leverage. The setting could not have been more symbolic. The ultimatum came just hours after a fiery United Nations General Assembly session in New York. The hall, draped in flags of 193 nations, had already witnessed heated debates on sanctions, climate reparations, and global inequality. When Traoré took the stage, his speech echoed far beyond the marble walls. His words pierced into the hearts of millions across Africa who tuned in via radio, live streams, and social media. "We did not come to beg. We did not come to barter away our soil or our dignity. Africa is not for sale." The applause was thunderous, but it was Netanyahu's immediate response that escalated the tension into a full-blown standoff. Behind closed doors, Israeli envoys delivered their message to African delegations. Unless Burkina Faso and its allies agreed to a resource-sharing framework, granting foreign companies unprecedented access to gold, uranium, and agricultural land, severe consequences would follow. Trade channels could be closed, sanctions imposed, and development aid frozen. The time limit? Exactly 72 hours. The message spread like wildfire. To African leaders, it sounded less like diplomacy and more like blackmail. To Traoré, it was nothing short of an attack on Africa's dignity. As the countdown began, panic and defiance mingled across African capitals. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets holding placards, "No deals. No surrender. Africa first." In Bamako, Conakry, and Niamey, rallies echoed with chants rejecting foreign ultimatums. Radio hosts debated whether this was Africa's Cuban Missile Crisis moment, a chance to finally stand united against external coercion. On social media, hashtags like Africa, No Ultimatum, and Sovereignty 72 began trending. The symbolism was powerful. A continent once divided by colonial boundaries was suddenly galvanized by a single deadline. Yet not everyone in Africa viewed Traoré's defiance as wise. Opposition figures in Burkina Faso warned that rejecting Netanyahu outright could invite economic ruin. International loans could dry up. Trade deals could collapse overnight. "It is one thing to resist," a former minister said, "but it is another to gamble with the survival of our people." Economists pointed out that Israel's influence stretched far beyond its borders, through its allies in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. A miscalculated step could mean Africa is cut off from vital technology, food imports, and financial systems. But for Traore and his supporters, the price of surrender was far greater. Inside the UN chamber, the drama unfolded like a political thriller. Delegations whispered in corners. Some African nations urged caution, fearing reprisal. Others rallied behind Traore, seeing in him the courage they had long wished to express. Netanyahu himself doubled down, taking the floor in a stern speech that dripped with menace. "We will not tolerate reckless leaders jeopardizing regional stability," he declared. "Time is running out. Decisions must be made." Cameras caught his glare directed at the African bloc. The tension was palpable. And then came the moment that turned the standoff into history. Traore walked back to the podium uninvited. The UN hall hushed. With calm defiance, he responded directly to Netanyahu. "No leader, no matter how powerful, has the right to give Africa an ultimatum. We reject it. Not in 72 hours, not ever. Africa will decide its own future." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Some diplomats clapped discreetly, others exchanged nervous glances. But one truth was undeniable. Africa had drawn a line in the sand. The countdown ticked on. News channels plastered ticking clocks on their screens. Analysts debated scenarios. Would Israel follow through with sanctions? Would Western powers back Netanyahu, or would they distance themselves from his hardline stance? Was Africa prepared to weather the storm of isolation? The uncertainty electrified global markets. Gold prices surged as investors braced for supply disruptions. Currencies in West Africa wobbled under pressure. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and beyond, the mood was strangely resolute. People lit candles in solidarity, singing songs of resistance deep into the night. What made this confrontation extraordinary was not merely the ultimatum itself, but the way it symbolized a broader shift. For centuries, Africa's leaders were forced into silence or compromise whenever faced with foreign threats. This time, under Traore, the script had changed. And as the lights dimmed in New York, capitals across the globe scrambled to answer one burning question: who will back down first? And as the lights dim in New York, capitals across the globe scrambled to answer the question: who will back down first? In Tel Aviv, the Situation Room inside the Prime Minister's office pulsed with urgency. Netanyahu sat at the head of a long table, his advisors and military chiefs surrounding him. On the wall, a giant screen tracked global media coverage. Maps of Africa glowing red with protests. International stock markets trembling. Headlines screaming about the 72-hour ultimatum. For a man accustomed to exerting pressure, this was supposed to be routine, yet Traore's refusal had turned the script upside down. One advisor urged restraint, warning that pressing too hard might backfire. Another demanded swift sanctions, arguing that Africa must be reminded of its place in the order. Netanyahu, jaw tight, leaned forward. "If we allow defiance today, we invite chaos tomorrow." But outside of Israel's war room, the narrative was slipping. African nations, long divided by old colonial lines and rivalries, suddenly found common cause. From the Sahel to the southern tip of the continent, voices rose in unity. No ultimatum, no surrender. In Lagos, Nigeria, a massive march shut down highways. Banners reading, "Africa decides, not Tel Aviv." In Johannesburg, students occupied university halls, demanding that their government stand with Traore. Even in North Africa, where some governments had maintained closer ties to Israel, popular sentiment swung heavily against the ultimatum. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Biden administration, already grappling with global crises, was pulled into the vortex. State Department officials debated behind closed doors whether to support Netanyahu's aggressive stance or quietly distance themselves. One memo leaked to the press revealed deep divisions. While hawks insisted America must back its longtime ally, doves warned that siding with Netanyahu risked alienating an entire continent. Do we really want to push 1.3 billion Africans further away? The document asked. The leak went viral, further fueling speculation that the West was fractured. Paris, too, felt the tremors. France, still smarting from its loss of influence in West Africa after military juntas expelled French troops, found itself in a dilemma. Macron's advisors feared that openly supporting Netanyahu would further inflame anti-French sentiment, but rejecting him risked a diplomatic rift with Israel. French newspapers split along ideological lines. Some painted Traoré as reckless. Others hailed him as the symbol of Africa's long-overdue awakening. But in Ouagadougou, the focus was not on Western hesitation, it was on survival. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré and his ministers gathered nightly, surrounded by candlelight during rolling blackouts caused by fuel shortages. Intelligence reports poured in. Rumors of sabotage, warnings of cyber attacks, whispers that mercenaries might be mobilized to destabilize his government. Traoré listened quietly, then repeated the same words. If we surrender once, we surrender forever. This is bigger than us. It is Africa's moment. The symbolism of his defiance carried beyond Africa. In Moscow, Russian state media replayed clips of Traoré's speech on loop, framing him as the young lion of Africa, standing up to Western arrogance. Analysts on Kremlin channels suggested this could be a turning point where Africa tilts eastward. In Beijing, Chinese officials played a more cautious game. They sent discreet envoys to Ouagadougou, offering investment, infrastructure, and diplomatic cover if Traoré held firm. Partnership without conditions, they promised, a direct contrast to Netanyahu's ultimatum. Markets, however, were less forgiving. Within 24 hours of the standoff, African currencies tumbled. The West African CFA franc, already fragile, dropped 15%. Food imports stalled at ports as insurers grew nervous about instability. Fuel shortages worsened. On the ground, the consequences of defiance were immediate. Hospitals struggled to keep lights on, transport slowed, and inflation spiked. Traoré's opponents seized the moment. In a fiery radio address, an ex-minister declared, "Our children will starve for his pride." Netanyahu may be arrogant, but Traoré is reckless. We must not suffer for his ego. Yet the people in the streets were unmoved. Night after night, protests turned into vigils. Women lit candles in public squares. Youth painted murals of Traoré with captions like, "Africa will not kneel." Social media swelled with solidarity, connecting Dakar to Dar es Salaam, Nairobi to Kinshasa. For the first time in decades, Africa's grassroots movement seemed louder than the whispers of its political elite. Back at the UN in New York, the drama escalated further. Netanyahu returned to the podium, his voice sharp, declaring that time was running out. We will not allow irresponsibility to endanger global stability. If Burkina Faso refuses, the consequences will be severe. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. But Traoré had anticipated it. With calm determination, he replied later that evening, "No nation owns Africa's destiny. We are not children to be threatened into obedience. If sanctions come, we will endure. If punishment comes, we will resist." Africa rejects this ultimatum. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some Western delegations walked out in protest, but a growing number of nations, Latin American, Asian, and Middle Eastern, stood and applauded. The divide was clear. This was no longer just a spat between two leaders. It had become a referendum on the world order itself. Was sovereignty still sacred, or could it be bulldozed by power? And as the deadline ticked down, 72 hours shrinking to 48, the world entered a dangerous new phase. Reports of cyber attacks hit Burkina Faso's banking system. Anonymous sources alleged that foreign intelligence agencies were preparing covert moves. Meanwhile, ordinary Africans braced themselves for what came next. Would this be the dawn of a new independence, or the beginning of a devastating isolation? As the second day of the countdown drew to a close, the air grew heavy with anticipation. In New York, the UN Security Council called an emergency session. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu huddled once again with his generals, weighing whether to strike harder or negotiate quietly. And in Ouagadougou, Traoré prepared to address his people one more time, promising that the fight was not about Burkina Faso alone, but about the dignity of every African nation. And so, with 24 hours left on the clock, the question sharpened into a razor's edge. Would Netanyahu risk everything to enforce his ultimatum? Or had Traoré already won by refusing to bend? The answer, the world knew, would define not just a deadline, but the future of Africa's place in the 21st century. With 24 hours left on the clock, the world held its breath. The ultimatum was no longer a diplomatic matter. It had become a ticking time bomb. In Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in the city center, waving torches and flags. They chanted songs of resistance, their voices echoing through the night. Africa will not kneel. For many, this was no longer about one man or one country. It was about centuries of submission finally reaching its breaking point. Traore emerged onto the balcony of the presidential palace, his silhouette framed by floodlights. The crowd erupted. His speech was short but sharp. Brothers, sisters, tomorrow they will expect us to bow. Tomorrow they will expect us to trade our dignity for survival. I tell you tonight, survival without dignity is slavery. If they close their doors, we will build our own. If they choke our markets, we will feed each other. If they threaten war, we will not run. Africa is awake. Africa will not apologize, the crowd roared, tears streaming down faces. Across Africa, the speech was broadcast live. In Nairobi, restaurants paused service so diners could watch. In Dakar, taxis pulled over, radios blaring. In Kinshasa, people climbed rooftops to get a signal. For the first time in living memory, Africa spoke with one voice. But inside Tel Aviv's command center, the atmosphere grew tense. Netanyahu's closest aides pressed him harder. The defense minister warned that failure to enforce the ultimatum would project weakness across the globe. Iran, Turkey, even Latin America will smell blood, he warned. Yet others cautioned that Africa's defiance had become symbolic, that punishing Burkina Faso could trigger a domino effect, forcing the continent to cut ties entirely. Netanyahu rubbed his forehead, eyes bloodshot, and whispered, "If we let this go, every small nation will think they can defy us." As the final 12 hours approached, the UN Security Council convened an emergency session. Heated debates filled the chamber. Russia and China accused Netanyahu of neo-imperial bullying. The United States tried to broker a compromise, but even Washington was split. One American delegate argued, "If Africa unites under Traore, we could lose influence for a generation." Another countered, "If we stand with Netanyahu, we risk being seen as enemies of sovereignty." The deadlock exposed the cracks in the global order. Meanwhile, sanctions had already begun biting. Oil tankers bound for West Africa slowed at sea. Banking networks reported sudden technical glitches. Burkina Faso's stockpile of medical supplies dwindled. Yet the more pressure mounted, the more determined ordinary Africans became. In Ghana, citizens donated rice and grain for Burkina Faso. In Tanzania, truck drivers offered to haul food for free. In Mali, gold miners pledged a portion of their earnings to support their neighbor. The crisis had transformed into a continental awakening. On the morning of the deadline, Netanyahu addressed the Israeli parliament. His voice carried defiance. "We cannot allow defiance to spread unchecked. If Burkina Faso does not comply, consequences will follow." Applause thundered inside the chamber, but outside, international markets braced for impact. The ultimatum would expire at midnight. That afternoon, Traore appeared on state television for his final address before the deadline. His eyes were steady, his tone unshaken. "To those who believe Africa can still be bullied, let this be clear. Our dignity is not for sale. We are not a colony. We are not a bargaining chip. We are a continent of nations, and tonight we choose to be free." As the clock struck midnight, all eyes turned to Tel Aviv. Would Netanyahu unleash sanctions, military threats, or cyber attacks? For hours, silence followed. Then came the first move. Israel announced the suspension of trade and security ties with Burkina Faso. Western allies hesitated, some joining in, others pulling back. But the response was far less decisive than Netanyahu had promised. Africa had called his bluff. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso's resistance spread. The African Union convened an emergency summit where leaders voted overwhelmingly to reject the ultimatum. Several nations pledged to create an African sovereignty fund, pooling resources to shield member states from external pressure. It was a small step, but symbolically historic. In the weeks that followed, the fallout reverberated. Israel's standing in Africa plummeted. Western credibility, already fragile, cracked further. Russia and China deepened ties with African capitals. Global headlines captured the shift. Africa defies ultimatum, emerges stronger. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. For decades, African nations had navigated global politics with hesitation, fearful of punishment for stepping out of line. Traore's defiance, win or lose, changed that equation. In villages, cities, and parliaments, Africans spoke of sovereignty not as a dream, but as a demand. Netanyahu, meanwhile, faced mounting criticism at home. Opposition leaders accused him of miscalculating, of turning Burkina Faso into a symbol of resistance rather than submission. He gave Traore the stage, one critic said, and Traore used it to speak for an entire continent. As the dust settled, history's verdict began to take shape. The ultimatum had failed to break Africa. It had awakened it. Traore's gamble may have brought hardship, but it also unleashed something greater: unity. And while the world debated the costs and consequences, ordinary Africans already knew the answer. The 72-hour deadline was supposed to silence Africa. Instead, it gave the continent its loudest voice in generations, a voice that declared once and for all, Africa will not kneel.